She married him for duty, then saw the human ascend as a battle deity. Lady Irissa stood in the grand hall of the Rykar Palace, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd as the murmur of excited voices filled the air. Her armor, polished to perfection, gleamed under the harsh lights, the dark metallic sheen giving her a fearsome presence. She was an elite warrior of the Rykar Dominion, a race known for their strength, honor, and unmatched skill in battle. Yet today she wasn't here to fight. She was here for something far more personal, though still just as important: her wedding. It was an arranged marriage, a political union designed to strengthen the relationship between the Rykar and humanity. Irissa had long known that this day would come. Her father, a high-ranking general in the Dominion's army, had chosen her to marry a human diplomat named Marcus Steele. The union was meant to symbolize peace and mutual cooperation between their two species, a bond that was to be honored for the good of both. To Irissa, the marriage meant nothing more than duty. She had no love for the human who would soon be her husband. In her mind, humans were weak, their bodies fragile, and their minds easily distracted. They lacked the discipline and strength of the Rykar. Yet she knew her duty, and that was all that mattered. Her father had assured her that this was the right decision for their people, and Irissa had always been loyal to her people above all else. As the ceremony began, Irissa's gaze flickered over to the man she was to marry. Marcus Steele stood at the altar, looking uncomfortable in the ceremonial garb of the Rykar. His human features were sharp, and his eyes were dark with uncertainty. Irissa could see that he was nervous. It was understandable. This was not his world, not his people. When their eyes met, she offered a brief nod, a gesture that was both respectful and distant. Marcus seemed to relax slightly, but she knew it wasn't because of her. It was because of the situation, the ceremony itself. It was a duty he had to fulfill, just as she did. The priestess, a dignified elder of the Rykar, began the vows. Irissa's mind wandered as the words of the ceremony echoed through the hall. She could hear Marcus's voice, clear and strong, as he pledged his loyalty and honor to her. His words were sincere, but they felt foreign to her. They meant little, just as her own vows meant little to him. This was not a marriage based on love. It was one of politics and necessity. When it was her turn, Irissa spoke her vows without hesitation, her voice firm and unwavering. She promised to uphold her duties as a wife and partner to Marcus, but there was no warmth in her words. It was all business, all for the good of the Dominion. She saw Marcus nod slightly as she spoke, his expression unreadable. As the ceremony concluded and they were officially bound in marriage, Irissa's thoughts were already focused on the next task at hand. The Rykar had an ongoing war with the Cathari Horde, a ruthless and brutal enemy that sought to destroy everything the Dominion stood for. That was where her attention needed to be. That was where her strength and skill were required. She glanced at Marcus once more as they stood together for the final moment of the ceremony. His nervousness was still evident, but there was a certain determination in his eyes now. Perhaps it was his resolve to face what was ahead, or maybe it was the realization that he had just been thrust into a role far greater than he had imagined. As they left the hall, surrounded by attendants and guests, Irissa felt nothing more than a sense of duty. Marcus was now her husband, but he was still a stranger to her. He was a man of peace, and she was a warrior. There was no room for love or emotion in their union, only the cold, hard reality of what needed to be done for their people. The next few days passed in a blur of formalities and obligations. Irissa and Marcus attended several meetings together, discussing diplomatic matters and strategies for the future. She couldn't help but notice the way he interacted with others, his calm demeanor, his ability to listen and understand, something the Rykar rarely did. He was different from them, but that didn't mean he was weak. Perhaps there was more to him than she had first thought. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, Irissa couldn't help but ask, "How do you feel about all of this? The marriage, the expectations?" Her voice was calm, but she had to admit she was curious. Marcus paused, looking at her for a long moment before responding. "I'm not sure what I expected, but I didn't expect to feel like a pawn in someone else's game." Irissa raised an eyebrow. "You're here by choice, aren't you?" "I am," he said, his tone softening. "But that doesn't mean I'm comfortable with it. It's a lot to take in." Irissa leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. "It's the way of the Rykar. Our lives are shaped by duty, by what is needed for the good of our people. You'll grow accustomed to it." Marcus looked down at his plate, seemingly lost in thought. Maybe, but I can't help but wonder if there's more to life than just duty. Irisa didn't have an answer for him. She had always believed that duty was the most important thing, that personal desires and feelings should be set aside for the greater good. But something about his words made her think. Perhaps, one day, she would understand. As the days turned into weeks, Irisa and Marcus continued their marriage in a quiet, respectful manner. There was no love between them, but there was understanding. They both knew their roles and they played them well. Yet, Irisa couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was more than just a figurehead in their political arrangement. There was something about him that she couldn't quite place, something that made him stand out among all the other humans she had encountered. It wasn't until the war with the Cathari horde took a sudden turn for the worse that Irisa began to see Marcus in a new light. The Dominion's forces were struggling to hold their ground, and the Rykar were facing their greatest defeat in centuries. Desperation began to settle in, and it was in that moment that Marcus showed his true strength. He had been in the war room, observing the strategies, offering insights. Irisa had seen him study the maps, speak with the commanders, and suggest unconventional tactics. She had never expected him to be so sharp, so insightful. When the Cathari forces launched their final assault, it was Marcus who came up with the plan to turn the tide. It was a strategy that no one had thought of, one that required a level of creativity and thinking outside the box. And it worked. Irisa was stunned. The battle that had seemed lost was suddenly in their favor, and the Rykar forces began to push the Cathari back. It was in that moment, as she watched Marcus's strategy unfold with breathtaking precision, that she realized, perhaps the human wasn't as weak as she had believed. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was more than just a diplomat. The war with the Cathari horde was intensifying, and the Rykar Dominion was teetering on the edge of defeat. Their vast, powerful empire, built on strength and domination, was struggling to hold its ground. Irisa, a seasoned warrior who had never known failure, felt the weight of the situation like never before. The Cathari, relentless and brutal, had pushed the Dominion's forces to their limits, and there was no end in sight. The hope of victory seemed to be slipping away. The war room was filled with the tense hum of discussions as military strategists and generals argued over tactics. Irisa stood at the back, observing the heated exchange with a calm demeanor. She was used to the pressure, the constant weight of being at the forefront of the battle. But today, something felt different. The enemy was too powerful, and no one had the answers. Marcus, who had been a quiet observer since his arrival, now stepped forward. His human presence seemed almost out of place in the midst of the Rykar commanders, but there was something about him, a quiet determination, that made Irisa pause. Despite the fact that he was technically part of the Dominion's diplomatic efforts, he had shown an unexpected interest in the war. He had asked questions, studied the battle plans, and observed the Rykar warriors with an intensity that caught Irisa's attention. "Perhaps we need to think outside the usual tactics," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the discussion. All eyes turned to him, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. "What do you mean?" General Verk, a grizzled veteran of countless battles, asked. His tone was dismissive, but there was an undertone of interest. Even he could not deny the dire state of the war. Marcus stepped closer to the table, studying the battle map. "The Cathari are relentless, but they have one weakness: predictability. Their tactics are always the same. They charge, they overwhelm, but what if we don't fight them the way they expect?" Irisa watched Marcus with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. His suggestion was bold, almost foolish. The Rykar had been trained in battle for centuries, their tactics honed to perfection. They didn't need a human's help, but there was something in Marcus's eyes that made her listen. Perhaps it was the way he spoke, his calmness amid the chaos. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence that he exuded, despite his lack of experience in battle. "We could use their predictability against them," Marcus continued. "Instead of confronting them head-on, we set traps. We create false fronts, lead them into positions where they think they have the upper hand, and then strike when they least expect it." General Verk raised an eyebrow. "And you think this will work?" Marcus nodded. "I do, but it will require all of us to work together. The Rykar have the strength, and I have the strategy. If we combine both, we can turn the tide." There was a long pause as the commanders exchanged uncertain glances. Irisa felt the tension in the air. This was a gamble, and the stakes were higher than ever. but something in her gut told her that Marcus might be onto something. His suggestion was unconventional, but the conventional methods had failed them so far. "I will not trust the lives of my soldiers to some untested human strategy," General Verk said gruffly, his pride evident in his words. But Irisa, for reasons she could not fully explain, found herself speaking up. "Let him try," Irisa said, her voice cutting through the room. Her gaze locked onto Verkas. "We have nothing left to lose." The room fell silent, and Marcus glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Irisa's heart raced, but she stood firm. It wasn't just that she believed in his plan, she believed in his potential. She didn't know why, but something about him felt different. Verk hesitated, his pride clearly at war with his desire to win. Finally, he grunted. "Fine, you have one chance, human. If this fails, it will be on your head." Marcus nodded, his expression determined. "I understand." The next few days were a blur of activity as Marcus's plan took shape. Irisa had never seen the war room so alive with energy, as soldiers, generals, and strategists scrambled to implement his tactics. The Rykar warriors, normally so confident in their strength, were now learning to think like humans, adaptive, creative, unpredictable. Irisa herself had to adjust to a new way of thinking, moving away from direct confrontation and into the realm of strategy and deception. As the day of the battle approached, Irisa couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. She had always relied on her strength and skill in battle, but now she was relying on something else, something she had never expected: Marcus. The night before the battle, Irisa found herself alone in her quarters, the weight of the upcoming conflict pressing down on her. She stood at the window, gazing out at the Rykar city below, the lights flickering in the distance. The thought of the battle tomorrow, of the lives that would be lost, loomed large in her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway, looking a bit uncomfortable but determined. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "For giving me a chance. I know I'm just a human, but I believe this will work." Irisa studied him for a moment. He had grown more confident since their first meeting, but there was still a sense of uncertainty about him, a humbleness that Irisa found both admirable and intriguing. She nodded, though she wasn't sure what to say. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice cold and impersonal. "I did it for the Dominion, for our people." Marcus nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. "I understand, but I still appreciate it." For a moment there was a long silence between them. Irisa's heart pounded as she realized that, despite herself, she had begun to trust him. More than that, she had begun to respect him. "Good luck tomorrow," she said finally, her voice softening. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You too," Marcus replied, his eyes meeting hers with a brief but genuine smile before he turned and left. The next day, as the battle began, Irisa stood at the front lines with her soldiers, watching as the Cathari horde advanced. The enemy was massive, their numbers overwhelming, but instead of charging head-on as they had always done, they hesitated. There was confusion in their ranks. Marcus's plan had worked. The Cathari had walked straight into the trap. The Rykar forces struck from unexpected angles, using the false fronts and decoy tactics that Marcus had suggested. The Cathari were caught off guard, their confidence faltering as they were surrounded on all sides. For the first time in weeks, Irisa felt a surge of hope. As the battle raged on, she found herself fighting with renewed strength, her movements sharper and more focused. She was no longer fighting just for victory, she was fighting for something more. As the Cathari forces began to retreat, Irisa found Marcus standing at the center of the battlefield, surrounded by Rykar soldiers. His expression was focused, his eyes scanning the horizon, but there was a new confidence in him, something that had been absent before. He had done it. The human had not only survived, but he had led them to victory. Irisa couldn't help but feel a deep respect for him now. The human who had been thrust into a war he had never asked for had, against all odds, become the key to their survival. And in that moment, Irisa realized that the person standing before her was no longer just a diplomat, no longer just her husband by duty. He was something more. He was a leader. And perhaps in time, he would become something even greater. The battle with the Cathari horde had turned the tide in ways that no one had expected. The enemy, once seemingly unstoppable, was now retreating. The Rykar, emboldened by the sudden shift in fortune, pushed forward with fierce determination, their confidence renewed by Marcus's brilliant strategy. Irisa stood at the front lines, watching the Cathari forces falter as the Rykar warriors closed in. The battle was far from over, but it was clear now that victory was within reach. Irisa had always known that Marcus was different from the other humans. He was adaptable, sharp, and strategic, qualities that had allowed him to prove himself when the Dominion's traditional tactics had failed. But even she had underestimated the extent of his potential. Marcus had not just helped them win a battle, he had unlocked something deep within the Rykar forces, a new way of thinking, a way to fight that was unpredictable and daring. It wasn't just his mind that had made the difference, it was his spirit. The Rykar warriors, accustomed to fighting with brute strength and unyielding discipline, had been forced to think outside of their usual rigid structure. Marcus's ability to inspire them had shown them that there was more to war than strength. There was also intelligence, creativity, and the ability to anticipate the enemy's every move. Irisa had watched it all unfold, her admiration for him growing with each passing hour. But it was not just his strategic mind that intrigued her now. It was the way he commanded respect, how his presence seemed to fill the space, how his words carried weight even among the fiercest of the Rykar warriors. There was a quiet power in him, something that made him stand out even among the strongest of the Dominion's soldiers. As the battle drew to a close and the Cathari forces scattered, Irisa found herself standing at the edge of the battlefield, her eyes searching for Marcus. She had seen him move with purpose through the chaos, issuing commands, coordinating troops, and overseeing the battlefield from a distance. His calm demeanor amidst the violence was striking, and it was in that moment that Irisa fully realized how much Marcus had changed, not just the outcome of the battle, but himself. He was no longer the nervous diplomat she had married out of duty. He was a leader now, a force in his own right. Irisa's thoughts were interrupted as she saw Marcus approaching, his face marked with dirt and sweat, but his expression focused and resolute. There was a sense of something powerful in the way he carried himself now, something that hadn't been there before. "You did it," Irisa said, her voice a mix of respect and awe. Marcus met her gaze, his eyes tired but determined. "We did it together." Irisa nodded, though she knew the credit was mostly his. He had masterminded the victory, orchestrating every move with precision. It wasn't just his mind that had won them this battle. It was his ability to inspire the Rykar to fight in a way they had never considered before. They had followed him without hesitation, believing in his plan and perhaps in him. As they walked together toward the command center, Irisa couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. There was still no love between them, no deep emotional connection, but something had changed. She had always seen Marcus as a pawn in the political game, a man she had married out of duty. Now she saw him as an ally, a partner in this war, and perhaps something more. The next day, as the news of their victory spread throughout the Rykar forces, something unexpected happened. Marcus was hailed as a hero. The soldiers who had fought alongside him in the battle spoke of his brilliance, his unwavering calm under pressure, and his ability to turn the tide of the war with his strategy. It wasn't just the generals who respected him now. It was everyone, from the highest-ranking officer to the newest recruit. Irisa watched as Marcus was celebrated, the weight of his newfound status settling on his shoulders. She had known he was capable of great things, but even she hadn't predicted this. Marcus Steele, the human diplomat, had become something far greater than anyone had anticipated. And yet, even as the celebrations continued, there was a quiet unease in Irisa's chest. She had never known a man like Marcus. He had risen to prominence so quickly, and with that rise came a kind of power, a power that she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. She had always been a warrior, focused on strength and battle. But Marcus had won their victory with strategy, with intellect, and with an inner strength that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than she had ever imagined. Irisa found herself standing in the command center later that day, watching as Marcus spoke with the generals, his voice commanding their attention as he outlined the next phase of the war. There was no mistaking it now. He was in charge. The Rykar had accepted him, and they followed him willingly, with a respect that Irisa had never seen for a human before. "How long do you think he'll stay with us?" Verk asked, his voice low as he approached Irisa. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on Marcus as he continued to speak with the others. Irisa didn't answer right away. She was still processing the reality of Marcus's rise. As long as it takes, she said finally. The Cathari won't stop until they have destroyed us. And Marcus will be the one to stop them. Verk glanced at her, a hint of disbelief in his eyes. You truly believe that? Irisa nodded. I do. She wasn't sure why she believed it, but she did. Marcus had proven himself time and time again. His tactics had outsmarted the enemy, and his leadership had brought them this far. Now he had become something more, a symbol of hope and strength for both the Rykar and the humans. Over the next few days, the war continued. The Cathari were relentless, but with Marcus leading them, the Rykar forces began to gain ground. Irisa found herself increasingly impressed with his decisions, his ability to read the battlefield and predict the enemy's next move. His strategies were becoming more complex, more refined, and the results were undeniable. But it wasn't just his military genius that had earned him the respect of the Rykar. It was his ability to inspire. He had become a symbol of hope in the darkest days of the war, and that was something the Rykar had never experienced before. Irisa could see it in the eyes of the soldiers as they spoke of him. He was no longer just the human diplomat. He was their leader, their champion, and they would follow him anywhere. As the war raged on, Irisa couldn't help but wonder what the future held for Marcus and for herself. They had come together out of duty, but now there was something else between them. Respect, perhaps even admiration. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she couldn't deny it. Marcus had ascended beyond what anyone had expected, and in doing so, he had changed everything. For the first time, Irisa felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper, something that tied her to him in ways she couldn't fully explain. She wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but she knew one thing for certain. Marcus Steele had become a force of nature, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Rykar Dominion was on the cusp of a new era, one shaped by the unlikely human who had turned the tide of their war. The Cathari horde, once seen as an unstoppable force, now found themselves on the defensive, pushed back by Marcus's strategic brilliance and the Rykar forces' newfound unity. The war was far from over, but the confidence that had been lost was now slowly returning to the Dominion. Irisa had always been certain of her path. As a warrior, she had been trained to fight, to lead her soldiers into battle without hesitation, and to be unwavering in her loyalty to the Dominion. But now, everything seemed more complicated. Marcus had changed things, not just for the war, but for her as well. She had never expected to respect him this much, let alone feel something deeper. But with each passing day, as she saw him lead with wisdom, compassion, and the occasional spark of humor, something inside her began to shift. Irisa had always viewed her marriage to Marcus as a mere formality, a political move, a duty she owed to her people. She had kept her emotions carefully locked away, focused only on her mission and her role as a warrior. But now, every glance she shared with Marcus seemed to linger a little longer. Every conversation they had felt more meaningful than it had before. It wasn't just that she respected him as a leader, though that was a large part of it. It was the way he had managed to stay true to himself, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. He wasn't a soldier, but he had the mind of one. He wasn't a ruler, but he commanded the respect of one. And in all of it, he remained humble, never letting the power he wielded go to his head. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Irisa stood by the window of their shared quarters, looking out at the city. She could hear the sounds of the Rykar celebrations in the distance, the cheers and laughter echoing across the capital. They had just won another crucial victory, and morale had never been higher. But despite the celebrations, Irisa felt an unfamiliar tension in her chest. She had seen Marcus rise to prominence, and with that rise came a kind of worship from the Rykar people. It wasn't just the soldiers who admired him now. Even the highest-ranking officials, the generals, and the nobility spoke of him in reverent tones. To many, he was no longer just a diplomat or a soldier. He was something more, a symbol, a hero. And yet, as the celebrations continued outside, Irisa found herself standing apart from it all, caught in a storm of her own emotions. She had been trained to think only of duty, of the greater good. Her loyalty to her people had always come first. But now, with Marcus becoming more and more central to their survival, Irisa couldn't help but question her own feelings. Was her loyalty still to the Dominion? Or had it shifted without her even realizing it to the man who had saved them all? Marcus! she said softly, turning away from the window as she heard his footsteps approaching. He stood in the doorway, his face illuminated by the dim light of the room. His eyes, always so calm, met hers. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle as if he already knew the answer. Irisa hesitated. She had never been one to open up about her emotions, especially not to a man she had once seen as a mere political partner. But now, with the weight of the world on her shoulders and the events of the last few weeks weighing heavily on her, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "I don't know where I stand anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I married you, it was because I had to. It was the duty of my people, and I had no choice in the matter. But now I wonder if that's enough. I wonder if it's enough for me to simply follow orders, to live by what's expected of me." Marcus stepped closer, his presence comforting yet powerful. "Irisa, you've always been strong. You've always done what needed to be done. But I think, deep down, you've known that duty is only part of the equation. You've known that there's something more, something that can't be defined by tradition or loyalty alone." Irisa's breath caught in her throat as she looked into his eyes. She had always known that there was something different about Marcus, but hearing him say it out loud felt like a revelation. She had always believed that her strength came from following orders, from keeping her emotions in check. But now, she was beginning to understand that there was more to it than that. There was the heart, the will to fight for something greater than herself, something she had never fully allowed herself to feel before. "Do you really believe that?" Irisa asked, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, a soft smile touching his lips. "I do. I think you've spent so long fighting for your people that you forgot to fight for yourself." Irisa looked away, her mind spinning. She had always placed her people, her mission, above all else. She had never allowed herself to think beyond that, never considered what she truly wanted, what she truly believed in. But now, with the war changing course, with Marcus by her side, she was beginning to question everything. The silence stretched between them as Irisa struggled to find the right words. She had never been one to show weakness, never been one to admit that she was unsure. But here, with Marcus standing before her, she felt something she had never felt before: vulnerability. "You've changed everything, Marcus," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've changed the way I see the world, the way I see myself, and I don't know if I'm ready for that." Marcus reached out and gently cupped her face, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to be ready, Irisa. You don't have to have all the answers. But I think you already know that the path ahead won't be easy, and it's okay to take it one step at a time." Irisa closed her eyes at his touch, her heart racing. She had always prided herself on being in control, on never letting her emotions dictate her actions. But now, with Marcus's words and his presence overwhelming her, she couldn't deny the feelings that had been slowly creeping up on her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. As the days passed and the Rykar's war against the Cathari continued, Irisa's allegiance began to shift. It wasn't just her loyalty to Marcus that had changed. It was the way she saw her own role in the conflict. She no longer viewed herself as a mere soldier or a political pawn. She was part of something bigger, something that could reshape the future of both the Rykar and the humans. And in that future, Marcus would play a central role. The next battle came swiftly, and Irisa found herself fighting by Marcus's side once again. But this time, there was something different. She no longer saw him as just a man she had been married to out of duty. He was her equal, her partner, and together they were a force that could not be stopped. As the battle raged on, with Marcus leading the charge and Irisa at his side, she felt a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about defeating the Cathari anymore. It was about ensuring a future where both Rykar and humans could thrive, side by side. And that future, Irisa now realized, depended on the strength of their bond. As the Cathari forces began to retreat once again, Irisa looked at Marcus with newfound admiration. They had done it, together. And for the first time, she felt truly alive, ready to face whatever came next, with him by her side. The battle with the Cathari horde had reached its peak. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and the sounds of war, clashing steel, battle cries, and the roar of engines echoed across the battlefield. The once unyielding horde had been driven back, their ranks thinning with each passing hour. And at the heart of it all stood Marcus, a figure who had transformed from a mere human diplomat to a force of nature. His presence commanded attention, his every move carefully calculated, his every word holding the weight of a leader who had earned the trust and loyalty of the Rykar people. Irisa stood beside him, her eyes scanning the chaos around them. She had always been a warrior, trained to fight with precision and strength. But now, with Marcus by her side, she found herself not just fighting for victory, but for something far more important, the future. The future they were building together. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm as he turned to Irisa, his dark eyes narrowing as he surveyed the battlefield. "This next move will determine everything." Irisa nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. It had been days since they had first set out to defeat the Cathari horde. Every battle had led them to this moment, the final confrontation. The Rykar forces, now unified under Marcus's leadership, had made incredible strides. Their confidence had returned, and their warriors fought with the kind of conviction they hadn't shown in years. But it wasn't just their strength that had given them the upper hand. It was Marcus's vision, his ability to think several steps ahead, to use their enemies' predictability against them. He had turned the tide of the war, and now they were on the verge of victory. As Marcus raised his hand, the Rykar forces surged forward, their weapons gleaming in the dying light of the day. Irisa felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as she moved with them, her blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. She had fought in countless battles, but this one felt different. It was as though the very fate of their people depended on this moment, and with Marcus leading them, they would succeed. Irisa's eyes locked with Marcus, across the battlefield, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. The sounds of battle, the cries of soldiers, even the distant explosions, all of it was drowned out by the connection they shared. In that moment, she knew what he had become. He was more than just a strategist, more than just a diplomat. He was a leader, a symbol of hope for both Rykar and humans alike. And now he had ascended to something greater. He was a battle deity not by birthright, but by his own strength, intellect, and unwavering will. The Cathari horde was on the retreat, their forces crumbling under the weight of the Rykar advance. But they were not finished yet. A last-ditch effort to break through the Rykar lines had begun, and it was clear that the battle was far from over. The Cathari would not give up easily, and they had one final card to play. A powerful warship, larger than any the Rykar had ever seen, was hurtling toward them, its cannons primed and ready to unleash devastation. "Marcus," Irisa shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the warship's engines. "We need to stop it." Marcus didn't hesitate. His eyes flickered to the warship, then back to the battlefield. He knew what had to be done. The Rykar forces were engaged on all sides, and there was no time to waste. He turned to Irisa, his expression focused and resolute. "Get the ground forces ready," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We're going to take it down, but we'll need everyone on board. You lead the charge, I'll handle the rest." Irisa's heart raced as she nodded. "Understood." Without another word, she moved toward the front lines, rallying the troops, her voice cutting through the chaos as she gave the orders. The ground forces prepared to launch a final assault, their weapons primed for what would be the most difficult and dangerous strike of the war. As the warship drew closer, Marcus stood tall at the center of the Rykar army. He was no longer the human diplomat who had been thrust into this conflict. He was the leader they had all come to depend on. His plan was simple but daring. Use the Rykar's remaining strength to create a distraction, drawing the warship closer, and then strike it from within. It was a risky move, but Marcus had always trusted his instincts. Irisa's forces surged forward, weapons raised high as they charged toward the warship. The Cathari had deployed their last line of defense, but it was clear that the Rykar were ready for this. Irisa's battle-hardened warriors fought with ferocity, cutting through the enemy ranks with precision. But it was Marcus's voice, carrying across the battlefield, that gave them the strength they needed. "Stay focused," Marcus called, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle. "We fight for the future, we fight for our people. Forward!" The ground shook as the warship fired, its blast narrowly missing the advancing Rykar forces. Irisa gritted her teeth, refusing to be slowed by the blast. She led her soldiers forward, her eyes fixed on the prize. They had one chance to take down the warship, and they would not waste it. Marcus moved with them, his mind calculating every move, every angle. He could hear the sound of the warship's engines, the hiss of its weapons charging, and the screams of the Cathari as they fought to protect their last hope. But he knew they were outnumbered. The Rykar had fought for too long, and now, with Marcus at their helm, they would not fail. As Irisa neared the warship, she saw the hatch open. Cathari soldiers flooded out, armed with deadly weapons and armor. Irisa's heart raced as she charged into the fray, her blade slicing through the air with deadly force. She fought with everything she had, her strength, her skill, and the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone. Marcus was with her, leading from the front, his presence a constant source of inspiration. The Cathari soldiers fell back as the Rykar forces pressed forward. The warship was now within striking distance, and Irisa could see the desperation in the enemy's eyes. They knew they were losing, but they were determined to take as many of the Rykar down with them as they could. "Now!" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He had orchestrated every move, every strike. He had calculated the perfect moment to launch the final assault. Irisa gave the signal, and the Rykar forces surged forward once again, their weapons trained on the warship's weak points. Explosions rocked the vessel as it took direct hits, its shields flickering and weakening. The Cathari crew scrambled to defend their ship, but it was too late. The Rykar forces had breached the outer hull, and the battle was as good as won. Irisa and Marcus stood together on the battlefield, their forces victorious, the Cathari warship now reduced to rubble. The enemy had been defeated, their final attempt to break the Rykar shattered. The war was over. Irisa turned to Marcus, her heart swelling with pride. The man she had once seen as nothing more than a political pawn had become the savior of the Dominion, the leader who had guided them through the darkest days of their history. She had watched him rise from humble beginnings to become something greater than anyone had ever imagined. And now, as the war came to an end, she realized that it wasn't just his brilliance in battle that had won her respect. It was his heart, his courage, his unwavering belief that humanity, Rykar, and all the other species of the galaxy could find a way to live together, to build a future worth fighting for. "You did it," Irisa said, her voice full of awe. Marcus smiled, his eyes tired but full of pride. "We did it." And for the first time, Irisa understood what he meant. They had fought together, side by side, and together they had won the war. And now the future was theirs to shape.